Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. 6 matches. One. The inspector put the notebook off to the side and said, "A strange case, Dr. Lehman. Yes, a strange case." "I don't find it that way," said the director of the institute. "You don't?" "No, I don't. In my opinion, everything is clear." The director talked very dryly, attentively looking at the empty square under the window, covered in asphalt and sun. His neck has been hurting for a while, and there was absolutely nothing of interest happening in the square, but he stubbornly sat turned around. Thus he showed his protest. The director was young and self-loving. He understood very well what the inspector meant, but did not believe that the inspector had any right to explore this side of the case. The calm persistence of the inspector bothered him. "He's throwing deep," he thought angrily. "Everything is obvious like chocolate, but he's throwing deep." "Well, to me not everything is clear," said the inspector. The director shrugged his shoulders, glanced at his watch, and got up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rybnikov," he said. "I have a seminar in 5 minutes. If you don't need me any more—" "Of course, Dr. Lehman. But I still want to speak to this personal lab assistant. Gorchinsky, I believe." "Gorchinsky? He hasn't returned yet. As soon as he does, he'll immediately be invited to you." The director nodded and left. The inspector squinted and looked in his direction. "Kid is lightheaded," he thought. "Don't worry, we'll get to you too." But before that, it was necessary to deal with the elephant in the room. At first glance, everything was almost clear. Inspector of Labor Defense Control Rybnikov could now have started writing the report on the case of Komlin, Andrew A., supervisor of the practical laboratory of the Central Brain Institute. Andrew A. Komlin was performing dangerous experiments on himself and is now laying for 4 days in a hospital between sleep and a coma, with a round buzz-cut head covered in strange ring-shaped bruises. He cannot talk, doctors are pouring painkillers into him, and in their meetings often mention the scary-sounding words powerful nervous exhaustion, damage of memory centers, damage of vocal and hearing centers. The inspector understood everything in Komlin's case that would have interested the Department of Labor Defense. It was very clear that malfunction of equipment, unsafe usage of it, or inexperience of workers had nothing to do with it. It was clear that no safety protocols were broken, at least not in the immediate sense of the word. It was finally clear that Komlin was performing experiments on himself in secret, and that no one in the institute knew anything about it. Even Alexander Gorchinsky, Komlin's personal lab assistant, despite other lab workers believing otherwise. The inspector was interested in something else. The inspector was not only an inspector. With the sense of an old scientist, he felt that behind the patchwork of information he had about Komlin's work, and behind Komlin's strange accident, hides a story of some unbelievable discovery. Going through his memories of lab worker interrogations, the inspector was getting surer and surer of it. 3 months before the accident, the lab got a new device. It was a neutrino generator, a device for the creation and focusing of neutrino bursts. With the appearance of the neutrino generator in the physics lab, a chain of events was kicked off which were not given the attention that they needed by responsible individuals, and at the end led to a big tragedy. It was at this time that Comlin, with visible excitement, gave all the work on his previous unfinished explorations to his deputy, locked himself in the room of the neutrino generator, and started up, as he announced, preparation for a series of preliminary experiments. This continued on for a few days. Then Comlin suddenly left his cell, did his usual check around the lab, performed 3 public criticisms, signed some papers, and sent his deputy to write the half-year report. The very next day, he once again locked himself in the neutrino hive, this time grabbing lab tech Alexander Gorchinsky. It was only discovered a few days before the accident what they were doing there, when Comlin, together with Gorchinsky, gave a wonderful report that would shake the foundation of medicine on neutrino acupuncture. But in the 3 months of working with the generator, Comlin thrice attracted to himself the attention of the lab. It all started on one beautiful day when Andrew shaved his head and appeared in the lab wearing a dark professor's hat. On its own, this fact may not have been memorable, but in an hour a pale Gorchinsky jumped out of the neutrino hive and, using someone's conceptual explanation, dropping cabinets, bolted towards the lab's first aid station. After grabbing a couple individual packs, he returned to the neutrino hive with that same speed, slamming the door behind him. One of the lab techs managed to notice that Andrew was sitting near the window, shining his bare skull, and holding his left hand with his right. His left hand was smeared in something, probably blood. In the evening, Comlin and Gorchinsky quietly left from the neutrino hive, and without looking at anyone, went straight for the lab exit. Both of them had a pretty downcast look. Beside that, Comlin's left hand was wrapped in a dirty bandage. Another event was remembered as well. A month after the incident, junior lab tech Bendiv met Comlin in the evening on one of the alley lanes of Blue Park. The lab manager was sitting on a bench with a thick old book on his knees and was muttering something under his nose, staring directly in front of him. Bendiv greeted and sat beside him. Comlin immediately stopped muttering and turned to him, strangely extending his neck. His eyes seemed kind of moldy, and Bendiv wanted to leave immediately, but it was impolite to leave so soon. And so Bendiv asked, "Are you reading, Dr. Comlin?" "I am reading," said Comlin. Shinayan, water margin. Very interesting. Here, for example, Bendiv in his young age was unfamiliar with Chinese classical poetry and felt even more uncomfortable, but Comlin suddenly closed the book, handed it off to Bendiv, and asked to open it to a random page. Semi-shyly, Bendiv followed orders. Comlin looked at the page, once, barely, nodded, and said, "Follow the text," and in his normal, musical, and clear voice started telling stories how some Huyanzhou raced to steal clubs and rushed to battle against some Jai Zhen and Jai Bao, and how some stumpy tiger, Wang Ying, and his blue wife. Only now Bendiv understood that Comlin was reading the page from memory. The lab manager did not miss a single line, did not mess up a single name, and retold everything word for word and letter for letter. Finishing, he asked, "Any mistakes?" An overwhelmed Bendiv shook his head. Comlin laughed, took back his book, and left. Bendiv did not know what to think. He told this anecdote to several of his co-workers, and they all advised him to ask Comlin himself for an explanation. Yet Bendiv's mention of their meeting in the reclusive lane of the park was met by such earnest confusion from Comlin that Bendiv, embarrassed, changed the topic of the conversation. But strangest of all were the events that took place literally hours before the tragedy. That evening, Comlin, happy and witty like never before, performed magic tricks. There were 4 members of the audience: Alexander Gorchinsky, unshaven and dazed by his manager like a teen girl, and a few young lab girls, Helen, Ida, and Katie. The girls stayed behind to finish the assembly of the motherboard for tomorrow's work. The magic was intriguing. To start, Comlin offered to hypnotize someone, but everyone declined the offer, so Andrew told the joke about the hypnotist and the surgeon. Then he said, "Helen, I'm now going to guess any object that you put in your desk drawer." Out of 3 hidden objects, he guessed 2, and Ida said that he is peeking. Comlin argued that he was not peeking, but the girls started to poke fun at him, so he announced that he could make flames go out with his sight. Ida grabbed a matchbox, ran off to the corner of the room, lit a match, and the match went out after a bright burst. Everyone was terribly surprised and looked at Comlin. He was standing with hands crossed on his chest and was frowning his brows, looking like a professional magician. "Look at those lungs," Ida said with respect. Between her and Comlin was a distance of no less than 10 feet. Then Comlin offered to tie his mouth up with a handkerchief. When this was done, Ida once more lit up a match, and once more it was put out. "Do you really blow it out with your nose?" inquired Ida. Comlin tore off the handkerchief, laughed out, grabbed Ida, and walked her across the room in a waltz. Then he showed 2 more tricks. He dropped a match, and it fell off to the side instead of down, making a very large angle to the left or right from the vertical. "You're again blowing," Ida said unsurely. Then he placed down a piece of tungsten spiral, and the spiral, funnily vibrating, glass and fell on the floor. Everyone, of course, was terribly surprised, and Gorchinsky started hassling him to explain how this is done. But Comlin all of a sudden got serious and offered to mentally multiply several multi-digit numbers. 654 times 231, and times 16, Katie said shyly. "Right," Comlin ordered in a strange, intense voice, and started reading off. 4, 8, 1. Suddenly his voice dropped to a whisper, and he finished off rattling 7, 1, 4, 2. Right to left. He turned around. The girls were shocked to notice that he immediately sunk, hunched over, as if got shorter. Dragging his feet, returned to the neutrino hive and locked himself in there. For a while Gorchinsky looked on with alarm, and then announced that Dr. Comlin counted everything correctly. If you read the numbers that he named right to left, you will find the product: 2,470,184. The girls worked until 10, and Gorchinsky helped them, although there was little good from him. Comlin still did not come out. They all went home at 10, wishing him good night through the door. When morning came, Comlin was brought to the hospital. So the legal result of Comlin's 3 months of work was neutrino acupuncture, a method of healing based on blasting the brain with bursts of neutrinos. The new method was already interesting on its own, but what did it have to do with Comlin's wounded hand? Or with Comlin's spectacular memory? Or with the tricks using matches, spirals, and mental math? He hid it from everyone, mumbled the inspector. He wasn't sure, or he was afraid to bring the blow on his co-workers. A complicated case, a very strange case. The videophone snapped. The face of the secretary appeared on the screen. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rybnikov," said the secretary. "Mr. Gorchinsky is here, and is waiting for you to call him." "Send him in," said the inspector. A giant figure appeared in the doorway wearing a plaid shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Above the muscular shoulders towered a muscular neck, crowned with a head covered in thick, dark hair, through which, though, was seen a small bald spot. Or even two, thought the inspector. The figure was walking into the office backwards. Before the inspector was able to be surprised, the owner of the plaid shirt, while continuing his moonwalk, said, "After you, Dr. Lehman," and let the director pass into the office first. Then the man walked in, carefully closed the door, slowly turned around, and tilted off a short bow. The owner of the plaid shirt and strange manners had a face decorated with a short but incredibly bushy mustache, and appeared to be somewhat dark. This was Alexander Gorchinsky, personal lab assistant of Komlin. The director sat in his chair and silently gazed out into the window. Gorchinsky stopped before the inspector. "And you?" the inspector started. "Thank you," hummed off the lab tech and sat down, pushing his palms into his knees and looking at the inspector with gray and unkind eyes. "Gorchinsky?" asked the inspector. "Gorchinsky, Alexander B. Pleased to meet you, Rybnikov, inspector of the DOLD. Very happy," Gorchinsky pronounced, pulling his words. "Komlin's personal lab assistant." "I'm not sure what that means." "Laboratory technician of the physics department of the Central Brain Institute." The inspector peeked towards the director. He thought he saw a sarcastic smile in his eyes. "So," said Rybnikov, "what topics have you been working on for the past 3 months?" "On the topics of neutrino acupuncture." "Specifically, please." "There's a report," Gorchinsky said reasonably. "Everything is written in there." "I would still ask you for specifics," said the inspector very calmly. For a few moments they were looking directly at each other, the inspector turning red and Gorchinsky shuffling his mustache. Then the lab tech slowly squinted. "As you wish," he exhaled. "I can be more specific. I was studying the effect of concentrated bunches of neutrinos on the gray and white matter of the central brain, as well as the rest of the organism of the tested animal." Gorchinsky's voice was monotone, without any expression, and even possibly slightly rocking in his chair. "Along with the fixation of pathologic and other changes in the organism, different decrement and labial curves in various tissues, as well as measurements of relative amounts of neuroglobin and neurostroming." The inspector reclined to the back of his chair and thought with rage, "Just wait for me, you." The director was still staring out the window, rhythmically knocking his fingers on the table. "Tell me, Mr. Gorchinsky, what's with your hands?" the inspector suddenly asked. He could not stand defense. He liked to attack. Gorchinsky glanced at his hands laying on the armrests of the chair, scratched, covered with blue and cracked scars, and made a motion as if he wanted to stuff them into his pockets, but only squeezed his monstrous fists. "The monkey scratched them," he said through his teeth, "in the vivarium." "Did you experiment only on animals?" "Yes, I experimented only on animals," Gorchinsky said, slightly emphasizing the I. "What happened to Komlin 2 months ago?" the inspector asked. Gorchinsky shrugged his shoulders. "I don't remember." "I will remind you. Komlin cut his hand. How did this happen?" "He cut it, that's it," Gorchinsky said rudely. "Alexander," the director said preemptively. "Ask him directly." The inspector's light-opened eyes narrowed. "You surprise me, Gorchinsky," he slowly said. "You are convinced that I want to pull something out of you that can harm Komlin, or you, or your other co-workers. But everything is a lot simpler. The deal is that I'm not a specialist on the central nervous system. I'm a specialist in radio optics. Only that. And I do not have the right to judge based on my feelings. And I am assigned to this job not to fantasize, but to know." The inspector chuckled with contempt and threw his notebook onto the table. Will you talk? Silence ensued, and the director suddenly understood what the power of this slow, stubborn person was. It seems that Gorczynski understood this as well, because he finally said without looking at anyone, What do you want to know? What is neutrino acupuncture? It's Dr. Komlin's idea, Gorczynski said tiredly. Exposing some areas of the crust with neutrino bursts causes the appearance, more precisely a rapid growth, of the organism's resistance to several types of chemical and biological toxins. Contaminated and poisoned dogs were healthy after 2-3 neutrino shots. There is some analogy to acupuncture, curing by needle poking. From there comes the name of the method. The roll of the needle goes to a burst of neutrinos. Of course, the analogy is purely external. What about the methodic? Asked the inspector. The skull of the animal is shaved, neutrino suction cups are applied to the skin. They're small devices that focus the neutrino burst. The burst is focused in the assigned layer of gray matter. This is very complicated, but it's even more complicated to find the areas, points in the crust that causes the phagocyte's mobilization in the assigned directions. Very interesting, the inspector said absolutely honestly. And what kind of diseases can you cure like this? Many. Dr. Komlin believes that neutrino acupuncture mobilizes some strengths of the organism unknown to us. Not phagocytes, not nervous stimulation, but something else, something incomparably more powerful. But he didn't finish. He said that with neutrino shots we will be able to tend any disease. Poisoning, heart diseases, uncontrollable swellings. Cancer? Yes. Burns, possibly even regenerate lost organs. He said that the stabilizing systems of the organism are enormous, and the key to them is in the crust. You need only to find in the crust points of application of poking. Neutrino acupuncture, the inspector said slowly as if trying to savor the sound's taste. Then he caught himself. Excellent, Mr. Gorczynski, I thank you. Gorczynski crookedly smiled. And now be so kind, tell us how you found Komlin. I believe you were the first to find him. Yes, I was the first. I came to work that morning. Dr. Komlin was laying in the armchair by the table. In the neutrino hive? Yes, in the chamber of the neutrino generator. There's a loop with suction cups on his skull. The generator was on. I thought Dr. Komlin was dead. I called the doctor. That's it. Gorczynski's voice trembled. This was so unexpected that the inspector hesitated with the next question. So, the director was tapping, gazing into the window. Don't you know what experiment Komlin was staging? I don't know, the lab tech said deftly. I don't know. A lab scale was laying in front of Dr. Komlin, and there were 2 matchboxes on the table. Matches were poured out of one of them. One moment. The inspector glanced at the director and once again looked at Gorczynski. Matches? Matches. What do matches have to do with anything? Matches, Gorczynski repeated. They were laying in a pile. Some were glued by 2 by 3. On one cup of the scales, 6 matches were laid out. And there was a sheet of paper there with numbers. Dr. Komlin was weighing the matches. Definitely. I checked myself. The numbers match. Matches, mumbled the inspector. Why did he need this? Is what I want to know. Do you have any sort of ideas about this? No, Gorczynski answered. That's what your colleagues said. The inspector thoughtfully rubbed his chin with his hand. These magic tricks, with fire, with matches. It seems that Komlin was working on some other questions, aside from neutrino acupuncture. But on which ones? Gorczynski was silent. And he staged experiments on himself repeatedly. The skin on his skull is all filled with the marks of your suction cups. Gorczynski continued his silence. Did you ever notice before Komlin's ability for rapid mental math? I mean, before the time he started showing you his tricks. No, Gorczynski said. I did not. I did not notice anything of the sort. Now you know everything I do. Yes, Dr. Komlin staged tests on himself. He tried the neutrino needle on himself. Yes, he sliced his arm open with a razor. He wanted to test on himself how the neutrino needle heals wounds. It didn't work. Then. And he conducted some parallel work in secret from everyone. From me too. What was this work? I don't know. I only know it has something to do with neutrino exposure. That's it. Did anyone other than you know about this? Asked the inspector. No. No one I knew. And you don't know what experiments Komlin conducted without you? No. You're free, said the inspector. You can go. Gorczynski got up without raising his eyes and turned to the exit. The inspector stared at the back of his head. Bald spots were shining white. Not one, but two. Just like he thought in the very beginning. The director was looking out the window. A helicopter was landing low above the square, shining with the mercury luster of its cabin. Slightly oscillating, it began to slowly rotate about its axis. It landed. A pilot in a gray jumpsuit crawled out of it, lightly bounced onto the asphalt, and headed to the Institute building, smoking a cigarette as he went. The director recognized the inspector's copter. Poured some fuel, he thought lazily. The inspector asked, Does neutrino acupuncture lead to psychological damage? No, said the director. Komlin claims it doesn't. The inspector leaned into the back of his chair and started staring into the matte white ceiling. The director quietly said, Gorczynski won't be able to work today. You shouldn't have. No, the inspector refuted. I should have. And I'm sorry, Mr. Lehman. You surprise me. How many bald spots do you think a normal person has? And the scars on his hands? A worthy pupil of Komlin. People love their job, said the director. For a few seconds, the inspector stared silently at the director. They don't love it well, he said. In an outdated way, Dr. Lehman. And you don't love these people well. We are wealthy, the wealthiest country in the world. We give you any device, any kind of lab animals, in any amounts. Work, study, experiment. So why do you waste your people so short-sightedly? Who let you treat a human life like this? When will this end? This is the first case in our institute, the director said angrily. The inspector shook his head. In your institute. What about the other institutes? What about the production lines? Komlin is the 8th case over the past year and a half. Barbarity. Barbaric heroism. They climb into automatic rockets, into auto submarines, into reactors at critical condition. He heavily chuckled. They search for the shortest path to the truth, to victory over nature, and commonly die. And here's your Komlin, the 8th. Is this permissible, Professor Lehman? The director stubbornly lowered his brows. These are cases in which this is unavoidable. Remember the doctors who vaccinated themselves with cholera and smallpox. These are historical analogies. Remember what time we live in now. They went quiet. Evening was drawing nearer. Clear gray shadows were growing in the corners of the room opposite windows. By the way, suddenly said the director without looking at his vis-a-vis, I authorized the opening of Komlin's safe. I was brought his working papers. I believe he'll be interested in them as well. Naturally, said the inspector. It's just, the director weakly smiled, there's too much specifics in them. I glanced through some of it, and I'm afraid it will be too much for you. I'll take them tonight, and if you want, we'll try to make an abstract for you. The inspector got honestly excited. Don't put too much trust in me, though, the director quickly warned. These neutrino needles, this was sudden thunder for everyone here. No one could even imagine something like this. Komlin is a pioneer here, the first in the world, so this might be outside of even my own grasp. The director left. Maybe Komlin's notes will help. The inspector really wanted them to help. He imagined to himself Komlin with a ring of neutrino suction cups on his bare skull, weighing glued matches. No, this isn't acupuncture. This is something completely new. And it seems Komlin didn't believe himself if he conducted such scary experiments on himself, away from his co-workers. A great time. A good time. The fourth generation of communists, brave, self-sacrificial people. They are still unable to save themselves. On the contrary, with every year they go braver into the fire, and huge forces are needed to use this ocean of enthusiasm with maximum effect. Humanity should walk to triumph over nature, not on and over the corpses of the best, but in the trails of powerful machines and mega-precise devices. And not just because the living could do much more than the dead, but also because the most precious thing in this world are people. The inspector heavily stood up and dragged to the door. He moved without hurry. First, this was in his blood. Second, age was saying its word. And third, his leg. Old wounds are weeping, he heavily mumbled under his nose when walking through the director's empty waiting room, heavily favoring his right leg. Three. Early morning of the next day, at the very hour at which doctors, who would not figure out the causes of Komlin's sickness, happily noted that the sick Komlin is regaining his speech, at that exact hour, Rybnikov and Lehman were once again sitting in the director's office at the giant empty table. The inspector was holding a notebook on his knees. In front of the director laid a pile of papers. Notes, diagrams, drawings, and sketches. Andrew A. Komlin's work journal. The director was speaking quickly, sometimes losing track, peering somewhere behind the inspector with eyes red from a sleepless night, sometimes stopping, as if listening with amazement to his own words. Listening, the inspector began to understand more about the order and connection of events. This is what he found out. Komlin did not start to work on the exposure of the brain to neutrino bursts by accident. First, this question was completely unclear. The method of obtaining neutrino bursts of practical density was developed fairly recently, and as soon as he got a neutrino generator, Komlin decided to test it immediately. Second, Komlin was expecting a lot from these tests. Particles of high energy, nucleons, electrons, gamma rays, disrupt the molecular and subnuclear structures of brain proteins. They destroy the brain. They are unable to create any changes in the organisms other than pathologic. Experimenting proves this. A whole other deal are neutrinos, tiny, uncharged particles without rest mass. Komlin was hoping that the effect from the neutrino will not cause any explosive process, nor any molecular changes, and that the neutrino will cause limited excitement in the nuclei of the brain, will strengthen the nuclear fields, and even maybe provoke new and previously unknown strength waves in brain matter. As it was found out, all of Komlin's hypotheses were proven spectacularly right. I understood far from everything in these notes, the director interrupted himself, and some things I simply could not believe. So I will only tell you about the most important, and what can shine some light on the mysterious story about the magic tricks. Nevertheless, this is also quite incredible. After the beginning of animal testing, Comlin immediately stumbled onto the idea of neutrino acupuncture. The lab monkey hurt its paw. The scar pulled together and healed uncommonly quickly. With the same speed disappeared the dark spots on her lungs, signs of tuberculosis, so common for monkeys living in temperate climates. Work with the neutrino acupuncture successfully developed. Several dogs were poisoned with various types of biological toxins. The neutrino needle healed them very quickly. On top of this, chromatography showed that almost all of the toxins were excreted by the animals in an untied manner. In 3-5 days, Comlin's needle dealt with tears, abscesses, and healed tuberculosis in monkeys 10 times more quickly and efficiently than the most powerful antibiotics. At this stage, when Comlin wasn't developing a method of therapy, but was only proving its principled plausibility, there was no need in testing on humans. In his famous report, Comlin voiced the proposal about the existence of some secreted healing abilities in humans and animals, currently unknown to science, but already exposed in experiments with neutrino acupuncture. He thoroughly explained a program of transitioning from experiments on animals to experiments on humans, a careful program considering all possible mistakes, foreseeing a series of transitions from the simplest and obviously safe neutrino injections to more complicated and nuanced ones. He assumed the addition of larger collectives to the experiment, including doctors, psychologists, and physiologists. However, the inspector was not mistaken. Comlin did not work exclusively on neutrino acupuncture. Very soon, experiments with the neutrino generator showed that the incredible growth of the healing powers of the organism were important, but absolutely not the only effects of exposing the brain to neutrino bursts. Tested animals behaved themselves strangely. Not all, and not always, those healed by short-term actions of the neutrino needle, in general did not notice any deviations in their behavior, but favorites, on which repeated and various experiments were staged, brought the two explorers to shock. And where the young lab tech Gorchinsky saw only comical or tragic jokes of nature, the intuition of a renowned scientist pointed Comlin towards a new discovery. The dog Jenny, full name Generator, found himself a new disposition towards demonstrating circus tricks, which he was never taught, walking on hind or even front paws, greeting, and Gorchinsky once found him in a strange state. The dog was sitting on a stool staring into a point, and after proper intervals of time stood up and quickly barked, after which he once more sat down. He did not recognize Gorchinsky and growled at him. Comlin was fascinated by an encounter with the baboon Cora. After exposure, Cora was sitting in a cell with Comlin and was peacefully talking to him. All of a sudden, she was as if struck by lightning. The monkey saw something in the corner, angrily and sorrowfully grumbled, and started backing off. Neither convincing nor softness helped. Cora ran off into the opposite corner, curled into a ball, and time to time began sounding a sudden noise, a signal of danger. This eventually passed, but Comlin shockingly noticed that every time Cora entered the cell, she first glanced at the forsaken corner. Once, Gorchinsky ran over to Comlin yelling, "Quick, quick!" and dragged him into the monkey cage. A young Hamadryas baboon was sitting in one of the cells and eating a banana. Nothing remarkable was happening with the banana or the baboon. However, both the security guard and Gorchinsky, both in one voice, asserted that they were both witnesses of something fantastic. According to them, they encountered the baboon at the moment when he was observing, with visible interest, a piece of paper which was slowly but surely crawling across the floor towards him, the baboon. The baboon reached for the piece of paper, and Gorchinsky ran to find Comlin. The security guard claimed that the monkey ate the paper. In any case, it was not found in the cell. Any attempts to recreate the encounter were unsuccessful. "This is what Comlin wrote about it," said the director, extending a post-it towards the inspector. The inspector read, "A mass hallucination? Or something else?" A mass hallucination alongside a baboon is already a fascinating thing, but there's something else here. With these animals, monkeys and dogs, you can't figure anything out. On my own. Komlin started conducting experiments on himself. Soon Gorczynski found out about this and showed no restraint in following the example of his boss. It seems that they had a small scandal about this topic. At the end, Gorczynski promised to stop experimenting, and Komlin promised to try only the simplest, shortest, and safest injections. Gorczynski never found out that Komlin was no longer studying neutrino acupuncture. Sadly, the director continued his speech, there are very few cases in Komlin's notes relating to truly miraculous results of his experiments. The notes become more scattered and unreadable. It seems that often Komlin does not have the words to explain his feelings and visions. His results lose stability and completeness. A few ripped-out pages of his notebook Komlin devoted to his irregular ability to remember, which appeared after one of the experiments. He wrote, I need to only look at an object once and I see it in all of its details, as if I see it even if I turn around or close my eyes. It is enough for me to look at a book page to then read it by the image that I have of it imprinted in my brain. It seems that for the rest of my life I remembered several chapters of water margins and the entire 4 sig fig table of logarithms, from the first to the last number. Enormous possibilities. In the notes appear thoughts of a general quality. Memory, many reflexes and skills, wrote Komlin in a firm handwriting as if pondering, possess a concrete, currently unclear to us, material base, an alphabet. The neutrino burst trickles into this base and creates a new memory, new reflexes, new skills. Maybe it doesn't create, but provokes the exposure of the latent. This happened to Jenny, Cora, to me. Pneumogenesis, the creation of an artificial memory. The most interesting and awe-inspiring discoveries of Komlin were devoted in the final pages, connected with a paperclip. The director picked up these pages and raised them over his head. Here, he said seriously, is the answer to your questions. This is something like an abstract or a rough draft of a future paper. Should I read it? Read it, said the inspector. Willpower isn't enough even to make yourself blink. You need a muscle. The nervous system plays the role of an impulse giver, an actuator, nothing more. An insignificant electrical discharge and a muscle contracts, with the potential to move tens of kilograms, produce work enormous in comparison to the energy of a nervous impulse. The nervous system is a spark in the powder keg. The muscle, gunpowder. The muscle contraction, explosion. It is known that strengthening the thought process strengthens the electromagnetic fields being produced somewhere in the brain cells. These are biocurrents. The very fact that we are able to find these means that thought process affects matter, however indirectly. I take an integral, brain field strengthen. The arrow of the machine observing and measuring them moves. How is this not a psycho engine? The field, brain muscle. I am gaining the ability to count extremely quickly. How am I doing this? I cannot explain. I just count. 1919 times 237. 454, 803. I multiplied mentally over 4 seconds on the stopwatch. This is amazing, but this isn't it. The electromagnetic field rapidly strengthens, but what about the other fields, if they exist? The muscle is developed, but how to control it? It's working. The tungsten spiral, weight 4.732 grams, hung in a vacuum on a nylon string. I looked at it, and it moved from the normal, 15-point-something degrees. This is already something. Stage of the generator. I talked to Gorczynski, said the director after reading the data entries. That night he saw a vacuum cone with a spiral hung in it. Then the device disappeared. It seems that Komlin disassembled it. The psychodynamic field, the muscle of the brain, works. I don't know how I do it, and there's nothing strange in how I don't know. What should you do to bend your hand? No one will explain that to you. To bend my hand, I bend my hand. That's it. And yet the biceps is a very obedient muscle. A muscle needs to be trained. It is necessary to learn how to contract the brain muscle. Question is, how? It's interesting. I cannot pick up a single thing. I can only move them around. And not how I wanted. Matches and paper, only to the right. Metal towards me. I work the best with matches. Why? The psychodynamic field acts through the glass cone and doesn't act through a newspaper. To act upon an object, I need to see it. Air, as far as I understand, starts to turbulently move at the point of an application of the field. I only put out the candle. The distance within the neutrino hive, I think, is irrelevant. I am sure that the abilities of the brain are infinite. Only training and some relevant activizations are necessary. The time will come when a person will count faster than any calculator, will be able to read and understand a library within minutes. This is very tiring. My head is cracking open. Sometimes I can only work during constant exposure, and by the end I'm all covered in sweat. I hope I won't crack. Today, I'm working with matches. With this, Comlin's notes ended. The inspector sat with his eyes shut and thought about how someday these ideas will bear their fruit. But this will be someday, and right now Comlin is laying in a hospital. The inspector opened his eyes, and his sight focused on a piece of post-it. With these animals, monkeys and dogs, you can't figure anything out. On my own, he read. Maybe Comlin is right. No, Comlin isn't right. He's doubly not right. He shouldn't have taken this risk on his own. Even when neither machines nor animals can help, the inspector once more looked at the piece of post-it. A person does not have a right to engage in games with death. What Comlin was doing was exactly this kind of game. And you, Professor Lehman, will not be the director of the Institute, because you don't understand this, and frankly are jealous of Comlin. No, comrades, I tell you, we will not let you into the fire. In our time, your lives are worth more than any grandiose discoveries. Aloud, the inspector said, I think I can start writing up the investigation act. The reason for the incident is obvious. Yes, the reason is obvious, the director spoke. Comlin cracked trying to pick up 6 matches. The inspector was escorted by the director. They walked out into the square and slowly moved towards the helicopter. The director was scattered, thoughtful, and could not catch up to the inspector's slow, limping walk. At the very entrance, they were caught by Alexander Gorchinsky, ruffled and dark. The inspector already shook the director's hand and was climbing into the cabin. This was difficult for him. Dr. Comlin is feeling much better, Gorchinsky said quietly into the inspector's wide back. I know, said the inspector, finally sitting down with a happy grunt. The pilot ran over, quickly crawling into his spot. Will you write up a report? Inquired Gorchinsky. I will write up a report, answered the inspector. So... Gorchinsky, shuffling his small mustache, looked the inspector in the eyes and suddenly asked in a high tenor, Tell me, please, aren't you the same Rybnikov who in '68, in Kustenai, on his own, without waiting for machines, discharged something? Mr. Gorchinsky, the director cut him off. Something happened then, with your leg. Gorchinsky, stop. The inspector was silent. He shut the cabin door and kicked back into the comfortable chair. The director and Gorchinsky were standing in the square and raising their heads, looking at how the large silvery bug flew with a weakening hum above the 17th-floor pink-white mass of the Institute and disappeared in the blue twilight sky.